Okay, so hi everybody, and welcome to the 30th episode of Now and Men. I'm Stephen Burrell, and as always, I'm here with Sandy Ruxton. Hi, Sandy.
Hi everyone, and yes, it's exciting to think we've now been running the podcast for around 2 years, so thank you so much to everyone who's been listening to us over this time.
Yeah, and so to mark what is something of an anniversary for us, we have got a bit of a special episode today with two guests. They are Professor Sanjay Srivastava and Dr. Romit Chowdhury. And they're two academics who have conducted fascinating research on issues of gender, cities, transport and mobility in India and beyond. And both of them have got new books which have either come out recently or will be coming out soon on these issues.
Yes, so Sanjay Srivastava is an anthropologist and British Academy Global Professor in the Department of Anthropology and Sociology at SOAS, the University of London. He's also visiting research professor in the Department of Sociology at Srinagar University in the Delhi region. And his research interests include urban cultures, consumerism, middle-class cultures, and the relationship between new forms of work and identity. And he's got a wide range of publications, but we'll concentrate today on his recent book, which is called Masculinity, Consumerism, and the Post-National Indian City. And it's published by Cambridge University Press last year.
Yeah, and Romit Chowdhury is a senior lecturer in sociology at Erasmus University College in Rotterdam. His research interests are in urban studies, masculinity studies, ethnography, and literary theory. And he's got a book coming out in August with Rutgers University Press, which is called City of Men, Masculinities and Everyday Morality on Public Transport. His earlier research has explored masculinities in the context of men's rights movements, sexual violence, caregiving, and men doing feminist research and activism in India. Okay, so hi both of you, and thank you so much for joining us today. It's lovely to have you with us.
Hi, Stephen, Sandy, Romit. It's great to be here. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. Great to be here.
Thank you so much.
So, Sanjay, maybe we can start by talking to you about your book. Now, you describe the city as a series of interconnected spaces, as I understand it. For example, home and street, family and public space, religious and non-religious contexts, and how these all interrelate and influence the ways in which masculinity is lived. So perhaps you could explain why you focus on masculinity and the city. Why is it important to study the different ways in which men in particular occupy and shape cities?
Yeah, thanks. I guess in all our social science humanities contexts, we come from traditions where the study of cities was about the city as a series of spaces that was not necessarily explored in terms of gender at all historically. I mean, if you look at whether in the Indian context or the European context, even the classic studies of the cities are about just a person. The Flaneur, for example, is a person. He's not a man, although of course we know he's a man. And in the Indian context in particular, I come from both urban studies scholarship tradition, but also a gender studies scholarship tradition. So I was interested in bringing these two contexts together. And it's only recently that, I think many, like Romit and others, have also begun to think about the city as spaces where men move in particular ways, shape cities in particular ways. And I was also interested in, because historically in the Indian context, Indian society was, within anthropology certainly, was about the village. That the home was a village. That's part of, in most post-colonial societies in Africa and Asia, the city was always a place of great evil, and where it was a village where the real tradition, real culture existed. So, and you went home to the village when in Indian cinema you wanted to go home. You want to find the real India. You want to find the real Nigeria. You went back to your ethnicity. You went back to your village, to the small scale. And yet, historically, of course, we know that it is cities that people are moving to, men are moving to, women are moving to, and what is it doing to the city, to the place that was historically seen as ungendered, as offering freedoms to everyone, and yet we know that there is no such thing as an ungendered there is no such thing as ungendered social life. So that's one tradition that I think of myself belonging to and thinking about. And of course, the other one has to do with the fact that within urban studies, there's a kind of tradition of looking at cities as fragmented in different kind of ways, as having a specific class here, a pretty different kind of class there, a ghetto here and a ghetto there, and yet anyone who works in any city has a sense that what happens in one part of the city. If a city, if people who come to service your house, clean your house, they come from another part of the city. There are connections between different parts of the city. What happens to the clean space of the city always connected to the so-called unclean space of the city, right? So I was interested in thinking of the city not as a fragmented space, but as a connected space. And what happens? How does one think of the city, any space, in order to think of social processes as connected, as what I do having an effect on some other part of the city, rather than excusing myself from the scene of my research, as it were, because then I can say that the kind of research I do has nothing to do with the impact that I have, but that's not true, and I think that's true of anyone who works in the present. I mean, I think to some extent historians are sometimes excused from that, because if you work in the present, there is no way that you can be excused from being a part of the problem. And that, I think, is one of the reasons why I was trying to think through the idea of the city is entangled, um, uh, different kind of spaces connected. And then in that context, then how do I think of the home, which might be, which is historically been a space dominated by men? If that is a private space, then how do I think of the entanglement between the private and the so-called public, shopping malls, whatever, and how are the two connected in as much as what happens at home, the kinds of relationships of power that exist in the home might also you might find also in a public like a plaza or so these are ways I was trying to think about it, and it's not just true of Indian cities, but I think living in London you can also see what happens and how different kinds of men relate to the city. In London, of course, what's interesting for me how migrant men, for example, relate to the city, because now they're moving to a different part of the world where they are now slotted in London into the hierarchically they're in a lower position than in their home countries. So how do they handle the city? So
And do you want to say any more about masculinity within that? I mean, you've mentioned it, as part of your answer, but I'm sure there's quite a bit more to say about it as well.
yeah, well, I guess much more explicitly, then you might say that historically, if you look at the ex-colonial, post-colonial context, such as India, the home was somewhere where men went to preserve masculinity because the hard work of modernity was to be done in the office, in the public space. But in order to recuperate one's masculinity and keep it as it is, you went home because that's where it was properly preserved, it was properly respected, um, and so there was always this tension between the city as so-called public and the home as a private, and the relationship between them. So a really significant way in which the city, I think, comes to play a really significant part in defining masculinity is to be seen as a threat to masculinity, a constant threat to masculinity, because there are multiple forces that come to play that preyed on masculinity, the kind of forces that you were safe from at home. So interesting, I think, in different kinds of ways, in the Indian context, certainly, in many other contexts, this tension continues to exist. That cities are places where masculinities are threatened, and yet and these are also spaces then people have to work out strategies for recuperating masculinity, for preserving masculinity, because after all, the masculinity is not just a relationship between men and women; it's also a relationship between men and men, different kinds of men. So, what kinds of men should occupy the public spaces of the city? Heterosexual men of a certain kind, white men, white collar heterosexual men, people in white collar jobs, for example. So, in different kinds of ways, cities continue to be really significant in as much as I think they continue to be seen as spaces that are natural to men, natural spaces, because they're public spaces, and there's a historical connection between masculinity and publicness, but also threats to masculinity. Because now, of course, women of different kinds also wander around the city as in principle as equals. What does that mean in terms of what does that do to space itself? And given that in any space historically, the idea was that there was to be a very specific relationship between men and women. I'm not going to say masculinity and femininity because these are not equal and opposite categories, but between men and women. And so cities continue to be really interesting places where you can see performances of masculinity precisely because of the notion that masculinity is a really fragile thing. It does not take very much to threaten someone's masculinity. Otherwise, you wouldn't need so many rules and regulations telling you what masculinity is if it wasn't actually such a fragile thing. The slightest provocation to masculinity, if someone overtakes your car, becomes a great offense to your masculinity. So cities continue to be really important because they are seen both as the natural spaces of men, but also threats to masculinity. And so, how does one deal with this tension? And that's why I think city is really interesting for me in terms of masculinity studies.
Yeah, and the title of your book is Masculinity, Consumerism, and the Post-National Indian City. And perhaps, when you talk about consumerism, perhaps could this be considered one of the kind of threats to masculinity potentially that you mentioned there? Because I think you talk about how there are these kind of masculine anxieties about like female consumption and how that connects to women's increased presence in public space. So yeah, I mean, do you want to talk a little bit about that more? And what are the kind of gender dynamics of consumerism in India? And could you perhaps also just say what you mean when you talk about this idea of the post-national city? Yeah.
Well, I'm interested in consumerism not as a threat. I mean, historically, all of us come from a certain kind of social science tradition where it's seen as consumerism has been seen as threatening some kind of authentic human existence. I mean, that's the tradition certainly that I've been a part of, a certain kind of broad left tradition. But I'm interested in how do people in a deeply asymmetrical society try and make their way through life? And one of the things is through consumer cultures, right? Now, the thing with consumerism is that in principle, it offers the potential for everyone to consume, men and women. And yet, in societies like India, to consume was to express a certain kind of autonomy because you're spending on yourself, right? You're buying something for yourself. And yet, women were, in other societies, other points of time, and certainly Indian society, as it continues to be the case, were meant to be the sacrifices. So you did not consume for yourself, right? You allowed the men in the family to consume because they're the ones who are doing the hard work of earning a living, being part of modernity, etc., etc. And yet, when high consumerism comes into play, starts to happen, capital allows everyone to be part of it in principle. And yet, there's also that threat that everyone is a consumer. Women who are meant to be self-sacrificing become not self-sacrificing but self-serving because they go to a shopping mall, buy things for themselves. Then that, in principle, alters that relationship between men and women because, after all, women are not meant to be consumers; they're meant to be sacrifices. So it's that peculiar thing that consumerism doesn't in principle prohibit anyone from consuming, but also contains a threat to masculinity. So how does one contain that threat? And I think the answer to that for me lies within consumerism. So it both poses a threat but also provides the answer. So one of the ways I explored this is to thinking about how, in order to contain the threat to masculinity, the consuming woman then becomes a moral consumer. That is, that she consumes, but consumes within very specific guidelines. That she's a consumer who then becomes part of public life, which is the domain of men, but also, when required, can come home to be the traditional woman, to look after children, to look after her husband's partner's needs, etc., etc. So I was interested in the ways in which consumerism, the dominant fact of our lives now, both poses a problem to masculinity, but also allows, as capital does to almost almost any problem in life, in inverted commas, an answer that you can be both a consumer and in principle then a threat to masculinity, but also how do men deal with the threat? Is that they deal with it through allowing women and women becoming moral consumers, following certain kinds of consumption. So for example, if you look at women's many so-called wedding magazines, bridal magazines, right? And there the idea is about choice. How do you plan a wedding, for example? In India, there are quite a few now. And the idea of choice is never about spousal choice. It's about the choice of goods and commodities that you have at your wedding. Because spousal choice allows you to move away from the restrictions of the family. Right? So women can be consumers of goods and commodities, but not other kinds of choices. So I was interested in the way consumerism is the grounds for both an anxiety, but also the grounds of a certain kinds of answers about to that anxiety. And one way in which you men, I think, are able to deal with that anxiety is the emergence of the woman as a moral consumer, with certain morality of consumption that you consume in particular kinds of ways that are part of that allow you to be both of the home, sorry, both of the world but also of the home. That you're not always moving away from the home. You come back home. So some of my work on gated communities, for example, you can see women in gated communities are taking part in uh, 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 all kinds of. Or let me give you another example just to end with. I did some work on this very large temple complex in Delhi, which is like a Disneyland temple complex. And it's based around ideas consumption. There's a very live cafe where people wear baseball caps with the logo of the temple emblazoned on it. It's a very very big sect of Hinduism in England. In fact, it's a particularly prominent sect in England as well. And what's particularly interesting is that you see lots of women only wandering around in this complex, which is a public space. Uh, but of course, and it's a space of consumption, right? But they wander around as moral consumers. They're wandering around as consumers, but within a space of religion, so that they are both of the world as consumers, but very much a part of tradition because they're in a religious space.
If I could come in briefly here, I mean, as an interlocutor of Sanjay's work, I think something that I've found very, very valuable over the years is the sort of linkage and the kind of vocabulary that he gives us to explore the linkage between masculinity and pleasure in the city. And pleasure, in a sort of very broad sense, of course, sexual pleasure, but also erotic pleasure. And this question, the link between pleasure and masculinity in city spaces, then in his work takes us to certain specific commodities like, say, footpath pornography. And then we are invited to look closely at the kinds of story worlds that exist in footpath pornography and what that tells us about what is desired, what is hindering the achievement of certain kinds of desires, but also into certain kinds of city spaces like, say, sex clinics, and what kinds of vernacular knowledges circulate in these sex clinics, what kinds of sexual performance problems are being discussed in these spaces, what kind of solutions are being offered. So this sort of conversation is something that I found very valuable in Sanjay's work.
Could you explain what is footpath pornography? That isn't a term I'd come across before until I've read your work. So yeah, could you explain that?
It's just very cheap, badly produced, poorly produced pornographic booklets, mainly bought by relatively poor men, migrants to the city, but they contain all kinds of things: advice on sexual performance, having sons, medical issues. So these are mainly accessed by, but not exclusively, increasingly, I think, by people who may not have access to more formal circuits of knowledge or doctors. And they're very, very popular and very cheap to buy. And you can buy them everywhere, everywhere, very colorful. Yeah, so. And you can buy them on the footpath, and that's why. And around railway stations, bus terminus, where people come into the city, go out of the city. So
Right.
people who are relatively at the bottom of the hierarchy in the hierarchy of
Yeah.
the city. So,
Yeah, and I mean, this makes me think about a topic which both of you have discussed, I think, in terms of like men's harassment of and abuse towards women, right? Which is something which is very pervasive in cities in lots of different contexts, not least in public space. And yeah, does that connect to? Is that a part of a response to women's increased presence in public space? I mean, perhaps that's something. Maybe could both of you just talk briefly about how that connects to your research, because I know it's something you've done research on as well, isn't it, Romit? About, if, for example, on public transport, and we know there have been some really high-profile, horrific cases of violence against women on public transport in India, for example, don't we? Yeah, do you have anything to say about how that connects with these issues of masculinity in the city?
Sure. I mean, I think one immediate response that I can think of is that in Indian cities and perhaps even further afield, also in European cities, I would say that men continue to be seen as properly belonging to public spaces. and the appropriate space for women continue to be seen as the home and the family. And one of the reasons for this is that the city is seen as a threat, as a potential threat for masculinity, but it's also seen as the place where men can fully become men. It's also a place where men can achieve their masculinity largely through breadwinning. That the city provides them with employment opportunities in order for them to approximate the breadwinner ideal. So therefore, the woman's presence in the city is often seen as a threat to that, the achievement of masculinity through breadwinning. So I would say that that is one potential reason, why a lot of men react with a great deal of aggression and rage towards the presence of women in public. But something that I found in my research, and I quickly want to flag that, is that we typically think of the patriarchal city as expressing itself primarily through violence. And yes, that's certainly the case. And given the spectacular nature of certain kinds of violences, that's something that has occupied the public imagination. But I found that there's actually a lot of seemingly innocent interactions that happen between men and also between men and women in Indian cities that prepare the ground, as it were, for more violent acts to be enacted. So, what do I mean by this? Many forms of male camaraderie, joking relationships between men, that sort of writes the city as a male space in which women's presence becomes a bit of an anomaly. So certain kinds of, say, men joking about, say, heterosexual desire, joking about women passengers, their sexual appeal. This is something that's seemingly innocuous, that's seemingly has nothing to do with violence. But I would say that this is one of the ways in which the city rights is written as a male space, which then legitimizes more violent acts to be performed against women and gender non-conforming people.
Maybe I could ask you a little bit more about your research, Romit, because you were talking about it there. I mean, obviously you've got your forthcoming monograph, City of Men, which is coming out. And as I understand it, that's based around the lives of auto rickshaw drivers in Kolkata. Do you want to say a bit more about the context there? And, what are their lives like? And you also talked a bit then too about threat but also opportunity, I think, and you mentioned in your work different themes or axes of conflict, cooperation though, and disappointment as key themes arising. Do you want to say a bit more about the background to your work and how those themes come through?
Certainly. I'd say that the book is essentially about two groups of transport workers in Calcutta. So one is the auto rickshaw drivers, and these are largely men who are from Calcutta, who have grown up in Calcutta, who've lived in Calcutta over multiple generations. And the other group of transport workers that I look at are taxi drivers, and they are largely migrants from poorer states in eastern part of the country. So I look at their interactions both among each other, but also with traffic police and passengers, and how these two very different groups of men, they're all working class, they're all men, but some are migrants, some are seen as local, how they really experience the city, and what that then can tell us a bit more generally about how the city becomes a patriarchal space. So that's essentially what the project is about. And my rationale for picking this or designing it in this way is that mobility is often seen as a masculine privilege or a masculine attribute. Men have the freedom to move. And women are typically tied to space and they are associated with stasis. So I was interested to explore, looking at really very mundane experiences of men. How do they experience mobility in the city? Do they see it as a freedom? In which conditions is it experienced as freedom? Can mobility be imposed? If so, how is that imposition experienced by men? This is something that I explore in the book. And another reason is that in recent, I would say since December 2012, I would say, a lot of public discussions around middle class women's safety in Indian cities has been framed around working class men, often working class men who are facilitators of mobility in the city, like auto drivers, bus drivers, taxi drivers, the principal threat of middle class women's safety in the city is seen as coming from these working class men. So I wanted to explore how they experience this kind of portrayal, how do they experience masculinity in the city, how do they experience also women's femininity in the city. So the project really is built around these questions.
The research you've done, Romit, is fascinating, and I love the methodology you used, because you talk about how these men who are driving these auto rickshaws, they are often working excruciatingly long hours. You know, they're often maybe only getting one day off a week at most, and so often I think, did you have to carry out the interviews like with them while you were like on the move and making ethnographic notes and things like whilst a passenger in one of the auto rickshaws? And so yeah, what was that experience like for you? Like, how did that go as a research method? And yeah, did any particularly interesting experiences come up in the process of doing that for you?
Oh, yeah, absolutely right. That's exactly how I had to do the research. I basically traveled along with these auto rickshaw drivers, taxi drivers as passengers, and began a conversation with them about their lives. Somewhere down the line, I told them that I'm writing a book about the lives of public transport workers in Calcutta, and if they would be interested to speak to me in a slightly more, slightly more formal, regimented way. But as you said, I mean, these men work excruciatingly long hours. So for the most part, it wasn't really possible to schedule an interview. So for the most part, I had to simply travel along with them and talk to them as they worked. So in a way, it made the research a bit difficult in the sense that one couldn't really say go to a cafe and sit and go through a sort of a list of questions in a very systematic way. But it also had certain benefits. So for instance, say I was sitting next to an auto rickshaw driver and talking to him, chatting with him while he was driving. But what this did was that he would also say we were passing through a particular neighborhood, and he would remember that this is something that happened in that spot, and he would tell me an anecdote. So in a very normal, natural way, certain spaces along our route served as pegs for memory. And this is something that I describe in the book. In especially with the auto rickshaw in Calcutta, there are many spaces of sociability that surround this trade. So there are certain neighborhood tea kiosks in auto rickshaw depots, where a lot of people congregate, primarily men, but also some women. So it was again, as a cisgender male, Bengali male, it was very easy for me to become a part of that space as a passenger and really talk to them, chat with them, get a sense of what their lives are about. So yeah, the fieldwork experience was definitely very interesting, and I also interviewed traffic police officers, and that was a little tricky. None of them agreed to speak to me, on record. But again, I spoke to them while they were manning traffic in crazy, noisy, busy Indian streets. And again, that came with its benefits as well, because I didn't insist on recording the interview. They told me things that they probably would have felt a lot more hesitant to say if they knew that their voices are being recorded.
You mentioned the relations between the rickshaw drivers and police. They were ones of, I think you called it homosocial trust. Do you want to say a bit more about that phrase? I mean, I think you mentioned it a little bit earlier, but perhaps you'll want to expand on it.
Sure, certainly. Something that I noticed was that, I mean, typically the relationship between police and, say, marginalized urban groups is framed through a language of conflict. And much of this is true. We know that the police is discriminatory in many ways. It's racist. It's in many ways it's casteist. It's Islamophobic, so on and so forth. But this relationship of conflict really coexists with a lot of everyday mundane forms of cooperation. And I wanted to shed some light on these mundane acts of cooperation. So, to give you a concrete example, again, as I was doing fieldwork one afternoon, I was traveling on an auto rickshaw. The auto rickshaw was waiting at a major thoroughfare for more passengers, and a traffic police intercepted and told this auto rickshaw driver that look, you shouldn't be waiting here, and I should be fining you for waiting in the spot unlawfully. And I noticed then that there's a certain kind of humor that emerged in that brief interaction between the auto rickshaw driver and the traffic police. The auto rickshaw driver started telling the policeman that, "Sir, please don't fine me today because I've promised my wife to take her to watch a film, and if you fine me, I won't have the disposable income to take her to the movies. And you're a married man yourself. You know what kinds of troubles one has to encounter if one doesn't keep a promise to one's wife." And the traffic police also the policeman, he also bursts out into laughter, and he's like, "Okay, fine, I'll let you go this time, but make sure that you don't commit this kind of an offense in the future." So these kinds of everyday camaraderie are provide moments of joy. They also provide avenues for marginalized groups of men to gain access to the city, to speak back to the work of law in the city. But they also script the city as a male space. For instance, again, I participated in a lot of workshops for safe driving practices that, again, traffic police were facilitating. And there also certain expressions of male heterosexual desire were normalized. For instance, say a facilitator, a traffic policeman would say that, "Yes, we all know that you love to take good-looking women passengers. You love to smell their hair and their perfume as they travel alongside you on these shared modes of transport, and that's all very good. But make sure that you're driving safely." So again, how something like safe navigation of the city is being tied to the performance of male heterosexual desire.
Right. And you mentioned earlier again that you've focused in particular on working class masculinity within your work, and how men in that group struggle to accomplish the norm of respectable breadwinner masculinity, if you like, but also other expressions of masculinity come up, so risk taking, mastery over space, male camaraderie, and all that as well. And I think you characterise this as a tension between attempts to find joy in everyday living and whilst fighting to survive in the city, and that struck me as quite an interesting tension. And I wondered whether you wanted to explain that conclusion, and also does it resonate with work you've carried out in other cities with urban poor? I mean, I know you've undertaken research in Tokyo, in Mumbai, in Manila. There's two questions in there, sorry.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think the question of disappointment is something that really recurred in my interactions with auto rickshaw drivers, with taxi drivers. They repeatedly registered a great sense of disappointment in the city. And one of the ways that this expressed itself is their reaction to urban infrastructure. We know that Indian cities post 1990s have changed rapidly and vastly. The infrastructural space of Indian cities has changed tremendously, visibly. There are flyovers, shopping malls, so on and so forth. But this group of laborers in the city really registered a kind of indifference to this kind of changing infrastructural landscape. They said, "Sure, the city has changed visibly, but it hasn't really changed my life in any way. My father struggled to provide for his family, and I have the same struggle." And this really indicates the great extent of the tremendous influence of the male breadwinner ideology on how men experience the city. That even though visibly cities have virtually become unrecognizable, still this change in the infrastructure landscape has no meaning to these men simply because they are not able to provide adequately for their family. Their struggles to do that remains the same. And that's something that really tells you about the influence of family life on men's public lives. And this is again something that connects to Sanjay's work on entangled spaces, that you can't really understand the public if you don't understand the private. And similarly, you don't understand family life if you're not understanding the impact of the city on it. And in terms of everyday joy, I think one example that I encountered in my research is even though these are public vehicles, the taxi and the auto rickshaw driver, often men, drivers of these vehicles, would use these vehicles as opportunities for leisure. So two auto rickshaws might be racing, even though they are very much faring passengers. They might race against each other and try to outdo each other. And this again connects to how historically working class men, especially, but also middle class men, have used public spaces of the city as, as spaces of leisure and even as a kind of impromptu sporting arena. So you have a lot of working class men, also middle class men. Even when I was growing up, we were playing cricket on the street, on interior lanes of the street, because we didn't have access to formal playgrounds, sporting facilities, so on and so forth. But as the city is recoiling, especially from the reach of working class men, working class men's right to the city is repeatedly being questioned. It's being disavowed. This is one of the ways in which working class men claim a right to the city by continuing to treat it as a kind of sporting arena, by making use of, say, a public vehicle as an opportunity for leisure and sport.
And did you have any reflections on experience elsewhere that have come up in your research, and what the differences were? I mean, obviously, you
Oh,
you'll
well,
have to keep it brief because we don't have a huge amount of time. But
yeah, yeah. Yeah, I think one commonality that I've noticed in my research in, say, in urban India, in Calcutta specifically, and in a place like Tokyo, is the influence of the nation. And maybe this is something that can connect to Sanjay's work on the post-national city. I mean, I found that the national ideas of gender, national ideals of gender, of masculinity and femininity, have a huge influence on how people are experiencing mobility in the city. So, for instance, a lot of Japanese women told me that one of the reasons why they can't complain against instances of sexual assault on Tokyo's densely packed commuter trains is that idealized norms of Japanese femininity disallow them from protesting. So, the good Japanese woman is someone who endures hardship without complaining. So this norm of Japanese femininity, idealized norm of Japanese femininity, creates an influence on Japanese women commuters. So they say that even if we are being assaulted, we don't complain because culturally we have no space to do that. We are supposed to endure hardship. So, in a similar way, who is seen as deserving of protection in Indian cities? Which woman is seen as deserving of protection, and which woman is seen as not deserving of protection, is also connected to ideas of idealized norms of Indian femininity. So, the good Indian woman becomes a sort of guiding as a kind of lodestar, as it were, to decide who deserves protection and who and violence against who is even justified.
it's interesting you brought in the notion of national discourses around masculinity, because I mean, just moving to Sanjay for a moment, I mean, I noticed that you used in your work the term Modi masculinity to describe the media image that's been crafted by and around the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi. Do you want to say something about the characteristics of Modi masculinity? Perhaps you both might want to comment on that as well.
Yeah, I'll preface that by answering a question which I didn't properly address when Stephen was
Sure, sure.
asking, which is that post-nationalism. What I meant by post-nationalism, of course, as Romit says, nationalism continues to be important, but in different ways. It's not the nationalism of the 1950s, an immediate post-colonial sort of anti-colonial nationalism. I think it's something different. And the difference is that now nationalism can be found anywhere. Whereas earlier, the sites of nationalism were much more specific, much more territorialized. Whereas I think one is the sites of nationalism are deterritorialized. So Indians can be genuinely Indian living in Germany and the UK, but earlier you could only be genuinely Indian if you lived in India, because you can maintain a certain kind of Indianness in any part of the world. By post-nationalism, I meant a move to a context where nationalism has become much more strongly linked with both globalization, so it's become deterritorialized, and consumer culture. And that's where I think Modi comes in, because he's someone, it seems to me, who allows both an attention to the nation as something quite specific, but also he doesn't say you can't have global consumerism, because he doesn't say that globalism undermines a nation, because that's not a part of obviously contemporary capital. Everyone wants more fridges, everyone wants more cars, etc. So Modi is the father who allows you to both maintain control over the house, over the domestic, by saying Indian traditions are important. This is what men should do. Young women should defer to their parents or fathers in particular. But at the same time, Modi is also the father who says it is all right to be a consumer. Whereas in earlier, under the what you might call Nehruvian kind of Indian modernity, he was very much a father figure who was anti-consumerist, and that's been the big shift. And I think that's where it seems to me Modi's success lies. He is both the father who is the father and says a particular kind of masculine fatherhood, masculinity in fatherhood is important, but also he's the father who says you can also have the world. How do you have the world? By, for example, women can consume, but they must also be moral consumers. So he's that kind of global national father, and I think that's where I think success lies, because consumerism, globalization generates certain anxieties about losing one's men's place in the world. The home becomes much more destabilized. Women might go out to shopping malls, they might have daughters, might have girlfriends, and yet Modi allows, I think, and yet no one does not want to have consumerism, right? People want to travel over the world. People want more fridges, etc., etc. So how do you balance this? And I think Modi is that figure, and I think his popularity lies is that he's that father figure, who is a father figure who says you can have both the world, but also as men continue to have control over the home, and that's where I think his success lies, and that's the kind of figure that he represents, and is widely successful because he provides both the access to consumerism, which poses a certain kind of problem to masculinity, but Modi also provides the answer to that. That if you have women consuming in these moral ways, coming home, then you can have both. You can have both control of the home, but you can also access the world.
But he's also in the tradition of sort of strong leadership, as exemplified by Trump, by Bolsonaro, and so on. But quite different, no?
Indeed, I agree. I mean, Trump is of course, Trump is he's a libertine in the way that Modi is not. Um, Trump is not a social conservative; he's a political conservative in many ways. In way that Modi is both a social conservative but also a political conservative. He's politically conservative. He's Trump is not in the same way, I think, interested in saying the kind of things that Modi has to say to his audience, because his audience is quite different. The kind of appeals to tradition that Modi makes, that he has to make by saying that I can give you both, I can give you the world, but simultaneously you will not lose control over the home. And that's very significant for the Indian context, given the kind of things, in fact, Romit was just talking about the important tradition and nation. How do you continue to be a nationalist figure at a time that you're also very much a part of someone who promotes globalism, globalization, global capital, public-private partnerships, etc., etc.? How do you balance the two? I think, as I say, I think consumerism provides the answer as well as the problem. So, and Modi is someone who has managed that. But I think manages specifically, and his success lies because of his prime identification as a man, not just as a politician, but as a male politician of a certain kind. It would not work, I think, if it was a woman politician. It's his masculinity at a particular time that allows him to offer it as a solution to certain sets of circumstances that we all want to be part of, and yet we as men might be threatened by.
Romit, I'm not sure if you have to leave.
I do.
You do have to leave.
Yes, I do have to leave.
Well, thank you so much for coming on, and yeah, hopefully we'll get to speak to you again in due course, and we'll continue talking to Sanjay.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you so much. Yeah,
Yeah,
be in
thanks for
touch.
coming.
Thank you. Bye.
Yeah, Sanjay, one thing I wanted to ask you as well, connected to some of the things you were just saying. You make reference to like the ways in which different groups of men, so for example, nationalist leaders or marginalized men, or men as consumers, or as heads of the family, or those who belong to kind of Hindu fundamentalist organizations, the different ways in which they might make and unmake masculine cultures in the city. And obviously, like, there's a lot of complex issues facing each of those groups, but yeah, could you perhaps just comment briefly on how you identify these different forms of masculinity which are going on in the city?
But I think in the Indian context, and I think also in some other parts of the world, for example, I think there's a specific way in which Muslim masculinity has been constructed by Hindus as a man who's a threat to Hindu masculinity. So in the politics of religion in India, for example, Muslim masculinity is constructed as a specific threat to the nation because the Muslim man has the capacity to lure Hindu women away, and through the term that's used in India as love jihad by many Hindu right-wing organizations, that what Muslim men are doing are seducing Hindu men and in turn then reducing the Hindu population and in effect, of course, emasculating Hindu men through their capacity, through some mysterious capacity to seduce Hindu men. And the term which has been very popular over the last maybe a decade is love jihad, of course, which borrows from the global discourse, American discourse of jihad in general. So the Muslim men have come to be constructed as dangerous, as risky, as mysterious, um, and hence something that needs to be addressed very specifically. So love jihad has become a very big term specifically to target Muslim men. If I move to how caste has historically been used, in a lot of Indian popular culture, if you look at old films, the hero was always, and this always, when you compare it to say film Hollywood cinema, the hero in the older Indian film was always like almost a fat figure, if I've used a roundish figure. He was never muscular. Um, and I think that has to do with the fact that specific ways in Indian context, caste is linked to masculinity. So to be a well-rounded figure, not a muscular figure meant that you were effective an upper caste man. Who else would be muscular but a working class man? Right? So, in different kinds of ways, historically in the Indian context, there's been very specific connection with religion and caste, for example. So now you have a lot of all kinds of men, regardless of caste, are muscular. That has to do with the introduction of a global consumer culture and the cultures of bodybuilding and going to the gym. Yeah, and that again has to do with ideas of class. So the different ways in which religion, caste, and class have come to be specifically linked to masculinity, and caste is particularly important. Masculinity and caste are also very important in as much as in many caste conflicts in India, upper caste men will often target the women of non-upper caste communities, specifically in order to demonstrate the so apparent emasculation of the men, that they can do anything to the women, and the men are not able to, as it were, in inverted commas, protect non-upper caste men, Dalit men are not able to protect their women. So the different ways in which, in the Indian context, in popular culture, in everyday life, in the way the politics plays out at present, caste, class, and religion are really significant in which masculinity gets defined. And of course, in public spaces, the power to be, to power to completely be a man continues to belong, of course, to the dominant groups in India, which are upper caste men, Hindu upper caste men, I should say, which brings together Hindu. I'll go one step further to bring in the other thing that should be important: Hindu upper caste, perhaps professional men of professional background. So bringing together caste, class, religion. It operates different ways, of course, for different societies, but I think this is how it might operate for the Indian context.
Well, I suppose I mean, one thing I was wondering, obviously we didn't get a chance to ask Romit this as well, but we do always like to kind of to ask our guests, a question about the personal side of this work as well. So I mean, one thing I was wondering was perhaps if you could just tell us a bit more about how you ended up getting involved in research on gender and pro-feminism and men and masculinities in the first place, and what led you to then, apply that lens to the city and to urban life. Yeah.
Well, my first work was on a boarding school, what in England is called a public school, like a boarding school. And so I became interested in how middle class masculinity were constructed as a particular site. But before that, I should say, I mean, I guess on a much more personal level, and I did economics for my bachelor's and my MA degree. And I think it was a great disappointment to my parents, not so much, but to my grandparents, because in the sense that most people in my background in India, most men would do science or a medical degree, a technology degree, but economics was kind of all right because it still has maths, the kind of economics that I did. But when I switched to doing anthropology, I think that was a greater blow, certainly to even to my grandparents, because anthropology and sociology were disciplines that historic, only that women did these kinds of subjects. Um, And economics is all right because at least it had maths and you did microeconomics and macroeconomics and econometrics. So when I moved into doing anthropology and sociology for a certain set of reasons, um, I became much more interested in of course, the gendered nature of knowledge and, of course, gender in general. And I should also say that I guess a lot of this research also comes from the fact that one has many women friends, and you learn from them. I have to say, when I started off, when I came from economics to anthropology, I mean, I you know it was something that interested me. But as someone who was an economist, I certainly didn't think I had much to learn from anyone who was not an economist. But friendship with lots of women has certainly been really important in terms of how one does this research. My first bit of research, which was at a boys' school, also introduced me to the possibilities of looking at masculinity as a specific way of understanding life. Um, and these are, I think, these are some of the ways in which have led me to this field. And also, I think masculinity is also, as I said, it's not just about men and women, it's also about men and men, different kinds of men. And that's what I think masculinity studies also allows you to understand, as to how does one understand the relationship between men and men, about friendships, for example, the possibilities of friendships and the constraints to friendships that one is socialized into, which I think just allows me to think, allows me to link what I do as a researcher also to my personal life. I mean, which is not to say that you become some kind of a utopian feminist figure, but that you certainly are allowed to think about life in a way that I don't. If I had not done anthropology, if I had not done the research I do, I would not have been able to think about life and in different ways. So I think it allows me to connect different aspects of what one does as an academic, but also as a person outside academia, just as a person. And that's why the research continues to be of interest to me on different levels.
I had one last question. I was just wondering, like, do you find it difficult doing your research? I mean, because you're taking quite a critical approach, really, aren't you? And you're looking at issues like masculinity, which people can find quite confronting. Like, so I know you don't live in India, but I mean, do you get much pushback on your research? And I suppose the flip side of that, do you see much hope for change? In positive directions on the issues you're working on.
I think there's pushback now. Because clearly, if you're going to work on masculinity, you are addressing really fundamental aspects of what are seen as Indianness, as it would be in many societies. So I think it's very difficult to do certain kinds of research in India. Because masculinity, most of us who work on masculinity don't just work on masculinity, it axiomatically connects to religion. And then, of course, that connects to what is now in the present environment seen as fundamental to Indian identity, certain kind of religious identity. So these are all linked. So I think it's more difficult now. But in the other context, I mean, it's impossible to predict. I mean, capital, which I now see as a dominant mode in terms of how the world operates, is not particularly interested in the ideologies. I mean, if there's money to be made in having a more gender equal society, and that's what will happen. So I can't say. I mean, even so, you do have more and more. So shopping malls, for example, in India. I mean, there's been a lot of critical writing. I'm not particularly critical of them. I'm interested in the politics of consumerism. I find lots of shopping malls allow young couples to meet who otherwise would not be able to meet elsewhere. So I don't really have in many ways, because I think of the current political environment, it's very difficult to do certain kinds of work. I've become increasingly open to now thinking about what is possible, what happens in these spaces. I don't automatically say, look, of course, I think shopping malls are bad from an environmental point of view. But what happens in a deeply asymmetrical society? What are the spaces where people who have no other capacity to access structures of power, where do they go? What do they do? And what's that minute? So, in a sense, I'm not really interested in revolution, I have to say. What is a minute incremental step up that someone can get that allows them to access something else? I did some work in a cabin crew training, where people do etiquette training, and people from really poor backgrounds come there. and try and learn certain ways of recognizing red wine and white wine and croissant. And some ways, many anthropologists, I would have said 20 years ago, this is like inauthentic culture. But what is it to me if someone learns in 6 months what all these terms are and gets a job in an airline and moves up socially? And that's what happens. Right? So, so because I think the current situation is very difficult, it has become very, very difficult. I see some possibilities in those contexts where 10 years, 15 years ago, I would not have addressed myself to these contexts because I kind of say, well, who am I to say that these people are gathering in inauthentic culture, unlike me who has a certain kind of education, has come from middle class background. Well, maybe this is what happens. This is how the world changed. I don't know. I mean, that's all.
Oh, well, it's been so interesting, Sanjay. I didn't have any more questions unless you did, Sandy.
No, I just think I wanted to say thank you, really, for coming
much.
on and,
Thank you to
giving us
both
such
of
an
you.
interesting insight into
Thank you to
city
both of
life.
you. Thanks to both of you. It was great. Thank you. I enjoyed
It was our
talking.
pleasure. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thank you. See you again.
Well, Sandy, that was our first attempt at interviewing two people simultaneously, and it was very interesting. What did you make of the conversation?
Yeah, no, it was really good, actually. And I was interested. I think both of them mentioned the notion of threat. And they weren't talking about threat in the city in relation to violence against women so much, but more about the city as somehow a site of threat to masculine identity in various ways. Yeah, the notion of being a breadwinner and how you're going to, struggle to make a livelihood and so on. But also, I mean, Romit was talking about the relations between auto rickshaw drivers and the sort of camaraderie between them, the risk taking, the racing that they engage in, that sort of thing. So mixture of threat and joy and pleasure seeking, I suppose. And I thought that was interesting because living here, I don't tend to think about cities in that way, although obviously they have those components to them. I mean, I would, if I thought about the notion of threat, I'd think about women's safety primarily. And I guess the pleasure-seeking bit was interesting as well, because that's shot through with some tensions, isn't it? I mean, I see, young guys driving around at high speed, competing with each other, having fun on our streets, and basically they may be having fun, but they're putting at risk pedestrians, cyclists, and other people. So their pleasure seeking actually impinges on others. So maybe these things are, very culturally specific, but I found that interesting concept to juggle with. Anyway, it's making me think.
Yeah.
So, how about you?
Yeah, but I am aware of there being some interesting research in the UK about like joyriding, for example, and that's quite interesting, isn't it? Because I suppose that kind of activity can be a way for perhaps especially for young working class men who don't have other ways necessarily, which are seen as being more legitimate by society of having fun and finding joy and expressing or enacting their kind of masculinity. And those can be quite thrill-seeking, risk-taking ways of doing that, in a bit similar to how Romit talks about with these auto rickshaw drivers. But at the same time, it does still express a degree of male entitlement to that space in a way, doesn't it? Of well, it's my space as a man. I'm gonna assert my kind of power over that space and prove my masculinity in that way, in ways which you don't see women doing to the same extent. And obviously, violence against women itself in the city, in public spaces, is obviously still, rife in India, in the UK, in cities across the world. And I suppose perhaps often that can be seen, isn't it, as perhaps a way of trying to assert male dominance over that space. I mean, I wanted to bring it up, but there wasn't time. That horrific case in 2012, the murder of a young woman called Jyoti Singh in India, horrific case on a bus, and I think that brought up real massive conversations there about violence against women, as we know in the UK from recent years as well, of high-profile cases of violence against women in public space. But did anything else come up for you?
Well, I was just thinking about your point about so-called joyriding as well. I mean, I live here in Oxford, as listeners will know, and actually joyriding was a real big thing possibly about 20 years ago, and I used to literally lie there at night and hear the squeal of wheels with these young men driving around very fast around some of the estates. But the thing I was going to mention in relation to it was that some people put it down to a connection with the decline of the car plant. Actually some of the more sort of traditional employment routes were being closed down, and that there was somehow some link with the activities of young men as a result of that. But there is something interesting about the link between the sort of pleasure seeking and the breadwinning, I suppose, or the thwarted ambition of breadwinning.
Yeah, because Romit, I would really recommend people read Romit's research if you get a chance, and perhaps when his book comes out, because the research he did with these auto rickshaw drivers was so fascinating. Not just least how he did it, but also, just like their lives sound incredible, just working all hours that they can, like driving these vehicles all around the city, and it must be incredibly difficult, hard work, and like the kind of class dynamics of the people they're driving around, perhaps often being quite middle class. But also, trying to find fun where they could along the way, and given that they were pretty much working or waking hours, doing that while on the job by like speeding past other drivers. And, which is kind of, there's something quite endearing about that, isn't there? But at the same time, there is also elements of danger and entitlement. Yeah, and like how safe women felt in those environments, for example, whether as passengers or as pedestrians or...
Yeah, I have been in the back of a tuk-tuk in Delhi. Oh. Yeah, I went to Delhi once for Men Engage Global Forum. Yeah, you'd be driving around. It was actually great. It was great fun, There was a sort of sociability about it, and a joshing, which was very, very amusing. Yeah. But the other thing that occurs to me, which again we didn't really have time for, was the connection between transport and environment and climate issues. And a lot of those rickshaws, I think they're trying to change them, but a lot of them are petrol, diesel, whatever, and levels of pollution, not just from those vehicles, but from all vehicles, in somewhere like Delhi, is absolutely horrendous. And you could really feel that in your throat, when you were there, in a big way. Having said that, I think I'm right in saying there's about 5 Indian cities that are part of the sort of C40 cities, right? And this is all about cities taking action to meet the sort of, the Paris 1.5 target, and mobilise all actors in order to achieve that. And actually, some of the Indian cities, I think, are making progress. So Kolkata, which is where Romit was doing his research, they I think have been introducing electric buses. Right. So that there is some progress. Yeah.
Thinking about like how can we embrace more sustainable forms of transport, and there are very gender dynamics there, aren't there? I think women are more likely to, here in the UK at least, to take certain forms of public transport, aren't they, like buses and things. But if we want to encourage more use of public transport, are we thinking about like how different people feel comfortable and safe using these different forms of transport, and or vice versa, like how it might be particularly difficult to encourage men to get out of their cars, which are often seen as being this real masculine status symbol, aren't they, and embrace a more collective form of travel. So there's so many interesting issues to consider there, aren't there? But for now, Sandy, thank you very much as always for that. And thank you to all of our listeners for staying with us for 30 episodes. And if you haven't listened to all 30 yet, then make sure you go back and go through the whole back catalogue when you get a chance. And yes, we shall speak to you again soon.
Yep. Speak soon.
Yes, and as always, do subscribe if you haven't done so already. Contact us at nowmen@gmail.com. Share the podcast with your friends and family and colleagues and so on. And take care. Thank you very much.